I'm Kelly, and today on the Everyday Cooking Show, we are going to be making sweet cherry pie. This pie is a classic, iconic Americana pie with a lattice and the most delicious cherry filling with a few special ingredients that are going to really amp up that flavor. So we are going to be using frozen cherries here. It is the dead of winter and you're not going to find any fresh cherries, but I actually like using frozen cherries for a couple of different reasons. The first is that they are frozen at peak ripeness, which means you're going to get a good quality fruit for the most part. The other reason that I like using frozen fruit is because when you put the pie in the oven, the fruit is still going to be pretty cold, and that gives your bottom crust a chance to start cooking first. So we're starting here with about 30 ounces of frozen sweet cherries. These are probably Bing cherries. They are the black cherries and they are sweet, much different than sour cherries. If you're using sour cherries here, the amount of sugar would be different. I'm using half a cup of granulated sugar, a pinch of salt, always. For the thickener, I am using quick cooking tapioca. But the reason that I like quick cooking tapioca is because it helps with super juicy pies like this. These granules absorb the juice. They leave the filling clear and vibrant. The texture of the filling is the perfect consistency. There are other options to use like tapioca starch, but personally I don't really enjoy the gumminess of that. And so quick cooking tapioca is my choice for any fruit pie that is very juicy. Just a couple of tips for working with this ingredient. The first is that it needs to be hydrated before it goes into the oven. That's where this liquid is going to come in. This is tart cherry juice. Tart cherry juice is going to help balance out the flavors, so we're going to add that in here. We're also going to add in a little bit of lemon. In the same way that the salt is going to help bring out the flavors, the lemon also is going to help brighten it up. And finally, we're going to use almond extract. Almond extract is a background flavor in here that makes the cherry flavor come forward, and it just rounds everything out. A little bit goes a long way with almond extract. You don't want to overpower it. Now that I have all the ingredients in my bowl, I am just going to give it a quick toss. What I'm looking for here is the tapioca granules to become hydrated. It's important that they're hydrated before they go into the oven and bake. If they aren't hydrated, they're just going to bake up as hard pieces of tapioca. A good sign that the tapioca is ready is when the sugar also has dissolved. So 10 or 15 minutes, set this aside, and in the meantime, we are going to roll out our pie crust. We are going to be using pie crust that I have already made, Flaky Pie Crust. If you want the recipe for this, it's going to be located in the description below. It's always best to have your pie dough made the day before, which this was, so it's ready to roll. You notice I have two different shapes of my pie dough. So this round one is for the bottom pie crust, and this rectangular one is going to be for the lattice. And it's not necessary, but it just makes it easier to roll them out in the moment to get those strips and to get the round for the bottom pie crust. I'm going to start with the bottom pie crust. Okay, before I begin rolling, I want to talk about rolling pins. Bottom line, the best rolling pin for you is the one that you feel comfortable with. But different rolling pins do different things. And here's the setup that I use that I find to have the most control over the pie crust. This is a French dowel rolling pin. It's a tapered dowel rolling pin. It's thicker in the middle and it gives you the most control about where you want your pie crust to go. So I start off with this and then I switch over to this simple dowel, straight dowel, because this is going to give me the even thickness that I want. Do you need two rolling pins to roll out pie dough? Absolutely not, but for someone who rolls out a lot of pie dough, I want to have the most control over it as I can, and this is what works for me. Okay, we're gonna get started. I would much rather you use too much flour than too little flour because there is nothing worse than your pie crust getting stuck to the surface. So liberally flour your work surface. I'm also going to flour the top of the surface and a little bit on the rolling pin. If you have too much flour, you can just brush it off, and that's why I say it's better to err on the side of too much than too little, because getting it stuck to the surface is kind of a disaster. To get started, this pie dough is very well hydrated, so I don't need to let it sit out, but if your pie dough is a little bit harder, you might need to let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes to soften up. If it is too hard, it will crack when you roll it. So the best way to know is that you can just push in, and if it leaves a little indent like that, then you are good to go. We're gonna get started by just telling our pie crust that we want it to move. And then I start applying even pressure. And you might notice that I'm not going on the edge. If I pushed it all the way to the edge, it would pinch it down. And I don't want that at this point. I'm just telling the pie crust where I want it to go, moving it around. It's also not a huge problem if it's not circular. You can cut it after you have finished rolling it to get it to where you need to go. It's starting to stick just a little bit here in the middle. See, it's that butter piece. So always bring some more flour underneath. At this point, it is roughly this shape that I want it, and this is when I switch over to the other rolling pin so that I can get it the thickness that I want. Pie crust should be around 1/4 of an inch, or sometimes even 1/8 of an inch. We're gonna roll out the lattice pie crust thinner than the bottom pie crust. For a 9-inch pie crust, you wanna roll it out to around 11 or 12 inches. But the best way to tell if your pie crust is rolled out large enough is to use the pie pan as a guide. And that's pretty good. I'm gonna just trim off a little excess right here. Doesn't need to be perfect. Now at this point, I'm going to brush away the excess flour, so we don't want too much on our dough. There's a few ways that you can transfer this pie dough. I'm gonna show you both. Number one, just pick it up. You can just pick it up and put it in your pan. That's if you have a really well-made pie crust and it's not gonna break. If your pie crust is more delicate, you can use the rolling pin and roll it up and move it that way. This is usually what I do when I move pies, because then you don't get any creases inside of it. So we're using a metal tin here, and that's gonna give this double crust fruit pie a really well-cooked bottom, but any pie pan is gonna work for this. So I wanna make sure that the pie is actually inside the tin here along the edges. So all I'm doing is just gently pushing it forward to make sure that it's in there well, and that's it. Once you roll out your pie crust, it's always best practice to pop it back in the fridge or the freezer for 15 minutes so that it can get cold again and that it has a little bit of time to rest. So I'm gonna put this in the refrigerator while I roll out my top crust. Actually, John's gonna put it in the refrigerator. Thank you, John. Okay, now we're gonna get going on the lattice. So for this one, I'm using this rectangular pie crust. Again, it's okay if you have a round one. For a lattice, we're just looking to make even strips. All right. So for the lattice, I want to get the dough a little thinner than I typically would, and that's because the lattice pieces are gonna be on top of each other. If you have too thick of a pie crust, it's just gonna get a little gummy. So I'm looking for about 1/8 of an inch for here. Always move your dough around, make sure that there's flour underneath it. The best way to tell how thick your pie crust is if you're a little bit new at this is literally just to get a ruler and measure it. That's a pretty foolproof way. It doesn't necessarily matter the shape here, as long as you know that you're gonna need a good amount of strips. You want it rolled out at least the width of the pie plate. So if you have the pie plate, this is a pie shield, you can see like, okay, this is gonna be good, and there's gonna be longer pieces and shorter pieces. So the fact that this piece is not the same length or the same width is totally fine. These are the tools that I really like to use when I'm making a lattice, but they are not essential. First is a pastry wheel. I like the double-sided one. One has a fluted edge and one has a straight edge, and then a ruler. So I'm gonna use this metal ruler here as my guide, and I'm going to use the flat edge here. Am I gonna have enough lattice? I don't know. I feel like I always underestimate how much lattice that I need. Okay, so we have our strips cut. At this point, the dough is getting soft, and the golden rule of pastry is to always keep your dough cold. So I'm gonna put this in the refrigerator to chill. Thank you. The filling has done exactly what I wanted it to do in that all the sugar is dissolved for the most part. There's little pieces over here. And that also indicates that the quick cooking tapioca is hydrated enough. So at this point, it's time to assemble the pie. I think one of the most frequent questions that I get is, should I strain the liquid from my frozen fruit before putting them in the pie? And my answer is, heck no, that's the flavor. Why would you strain out the flavor? If the pie has the proper thickening and it's cooked to the correct temperature, you want all of that flavor and filling, like that juiciness inside of the pie. So I never strain out fruit because I don't like throwing out flavor. All the filling is inside of the pie crust, and now I want to do something to prevent the crust from shrinking after it's baked. And the biggest reason that happens is because there's gaps, space in between the fruit. So I just want to take a minute, 30 seconds, to just really make sure that there is no gaps in between any of the fruit. You could do a full pie top on here and just cut some ventilation holes, but we are gonna do the lattice. There is one small detail I need to mention about the quick cooking tapioca. When you're doing a lattice, you don't wanna make the gaps in the lattice too large, because if the quick cooking tapioca, like right on top here, comes into contact with the heat, it can again turn into little crunchy pieces of tapioca, which is never ideal. So we're gonna weave a tight lattice for this. The way that I like to weave a lattice is sort of from the inside out, and there are many, many different ways to do it. You do it the way that you like. I find this to be the easiest. You start with the largest pieces of the lattice that are gonna fit the width of the pie, make a cross. And I'm just working from the inside out. So this is the first one, and then you bring up this centerpiece. I'm not gonna have enough lattice. You bring up this centerpiece, put it over, put it down. I don't have enough lattice. It's okay. We're gonna make it happen. Okay, last two pieces. Beautiful. Just barely enough. You can weave the lattice in different patterns. You can weave it diagonally. I'm a big fan of the classic grid pattern, and so that's usually what I do. I love scissors for so many different tasks, especially with pastry, and I find that this is the best way to get a really nice, even, pretty crust. So we're just trimming off the excess, and I've set the pie up so that I'm going to flip the pastry over to make the edge, but there are other ways you can do it. You can flip it under, or you can just leave it as is, just building up maybe a little bit of an edge. I'm gonna bring over the edge and crimp it at the same time. I'm just using my thumb and my forefingers here and pressing them together. I like doing it this way because it's gonna showcase the flakiness of the crust. There we go. You can fuss around with it a little bit more, but I think that this is perfect. The only thing it's missing is an egg wash. An egg wash is optional, but it adds a beautiful shine to the crust. If you're gonna put sugar on top of your pie, it gives the sugar a place to stick to. An egg wash is pretty simple. It's an egg and a little bit of added liquid. I'm just gonna be using a little bit of water. Just a light egg wash is all it needs. I'm not gonna egg wash the edges too much because they already brown well enough on their own. So I'm just gonna keep the egg wash here in the center of the pie. At this point, I'm gonna go put this pie in the freezer for 15 minutes while the oven preheats to 425 degrees. I feel like this brief stint in the freezer really helps the pie bake up better. This is going to bake at 425 on the lowest rack in your oven for about 20 minutes. And then after that, you lower the heat to 400 and you move the pie up into the middle of the oven, and it's going to bake until the pie has reached an internal temperature of 200 degrees and the pie crust is evenly golden throughout. I made this pie earlier and it has been cooling for quite a few hours. You cannot slice into a very warm pie because you're gonna have pie soup. Delicious, that's fine, but if you're looking for a pretty clean slice, you need to let it set up, especially with quick cooking tapioca. It reaches its maximum gelation at around 6 to 7 hours after, and you're gonna get the perfect texture in the pie. These are the tools that I use to cut a pie: a serrated knife and a small offset spatula. And my trick is that I cut 3 slices first and then I take out the middle one. I don't know why that works, but it seems to work pretty well for me. The only thing to pay attention to is this is a metal plate and I don't want to cut the metal non-stick. The reason that I like to use this small offset spatula instead of, say, a pie spatula is because this is flexible and you can really get underneath there and get control of the pie slice, versus this is not at all flexible and so you're more likely to break the slice. Highly recommend. All right, fingers crossed. Is it gonna be a good one? The moment of truth. Yeah, it's good. It's good. All right, it's time to eat it. The best part. I think it is perfectly set. I think it has a good amount of juice. Can we just look at that? I love that.
The center grab.
Here we go. I love the almond in this. It hangs in the background, but it just makes it feel a little bit more cherry. I love the juiciness, the consistency of it. Adding that tart cherry juice, I feel like just really sends it over the edge of how much it feels like cherry, but it's not cloyingly sweet like you would think a sweet cherry pie is, perfectly balanced. A double fruit pie with a flaky crust is just like one of the most delicious things in the world. And this doesn't disappoint. Doesn't even need ice cream. It's perfect all on its own. I feel like you can't get a better cherry pie than this.